South Africa's unemployment rate improved slightly in the first quarter of the year. Data from Stats SA shows the official unemployment rate was 34.5% in the fourth quarter, down from 35.3% in the fourth quarter. Pardon me. So that was 34.5% in the first quarter of this year, compared with 35.3% in the fourth quarter of last year. The Statistics Agency says 370,000 jobs were gained at the beginning of this year. Well, for more on this, let's speak now to Old Mutual Chief Economist, Johann Els. Very good afternoon, Johann. Thank you very much for joining us. Just give us your initial thoughts around the unemployment number.
Hi, good afternoon. Yes, of course, any good news should be celebrated, but it's still a very high unemployment rate. And the fact of the matter is that with very weak economic growth coming into the COVID crisis, we already had a huge unemployment problem before COVID, and of course now impacted by this. To the extent that total employment is still down 1.5 million people from just before COVID lockdown started in South Africa. So it's still a dismal situation, even though we've seen some slight improvements in terms of the number of employed people between the fourth quarter of last year and the first quarter of this year. And of course, as you said, the unemployment rate coming off a little bit.
Yeah, and just in terms of trend, is it usual to get a slight pickup in employment numbers in the first quarter of a given year vis-a-vis what happens in the fourth quarter, or not really?
Not really, but these numbers are supposed to be seasonally adjusted, so that should take into account some of those seasonal trends. But, you know, we have to be honest, the employment data in South Africa is, in my opinion, not as good as the GDP data or the inflation data, which are excellent numbers on its own. Employment is a little bit more difficult, and Stats SA has also told us that in terms of the surveying of people out there, it has been difficult in terms of the responses they've received. There was a big improvement in responses in the first quarter in terms of their surveying, but it's not back to the levels as we had before COVID. So there's some distortions within the data, and I suppose we should take that into account when we analyze the numbers. So as you rightly said, we should look at the broader trends rather than the specific detail.
Yeah. Let's perhaps drill down per sector. Let's take a look at agriculture, for example. That sector didn't perform very well in the first quarter, with unemployment levels coming down there, increasing there. What is going on in the agricultural sector, or what has been happening there? We know that, for example, the Russia-Ukraine conflict kicked in during the first quarter in February. To what extent has the agricultural sector been impacted by that particular issue?
Yeah, I don't think in the first quarter there was yet any Russia-Ukrainian war impact in our agricultural sector. To be honest, I'm a bit surprised by the numbers in that sector, given that, you know, we've got a pretty decent maize crop this year in South Africa compared to previous years. Perhaps not the biggest, but pretty decent. And maize is by far the biggest crop within the agricultural sector. So I suspect there's some trends within other areas of agriculture that we're not aware of. I was actually surprised of the numbers in that sector.
Should we be concerned that the most of the jobs growth that was seen in the first quarter was in the government sector, which we know has been looking to cut costs in that regard, and that the private sector itself hasn't really been boosted in terms of jobs relative to the government?
Yes, that's a good point, which I actually wanted to make. The 281,000 increase in the public sector employment numbers between the fourth quarter and the first quarter. That was perhaps a bit of a surprise. And as you rightly said, then the private sector was not nearly as great in terms of the positive increase between those two quarters. But I suspect that part of that, and we know government wants to save money in terms of their wage bill size. So, but I think some of that is the employment numbers in the public sector that has been coming through in terms of the presidential jobs initiative, where there's been a specific emphasis on getting some employment numbers through. So in that sense, we should celebrate those numbers because it's positive. The presidential jobs initiative is working. It's giving some employment to some unemployed people. It's giving some incomes in terms of that coming through. So I think that's a good number. Of course, if that was a permanent trend in terms of national government departments or state-owned enterprises, I would be worried about that because of the pressure on cutting government's expenditure, especially on the wage bill, which is almost a third of total government spending.
Yeah.
But in this case, there's a specific emphasis on the presidential jobs initiative.
So if we look at the broader macroeconomic picture, Johann, in terms of obviously our slow growth rate, incessant electricity outages with load shedding, the possibility that we may be getting severe increases in fuel prices tonight, ranging around sort of £3.80 a litre, depending on what fuel you have, a myriad of other issues. I mean, how do we look? And you know, based on this picture, what does that mean for the unemployment picture going forward? Yeah,
as you rightly say, there's lots of potential negatives around, from petrol prices, food prices, overall inflation, interest rate increases, lots of uncertainty as well. But we have to take into account, if we talk about pricing first, we want to be a market-based economy. We are a market-based economy, and then we have to realize that government cannot always control pricing. That's crucially important. So within these varied price measures that we see, we as consumers adjust our spending patterns. So if we're forced to spend more on fuel or transport, we spend less elsewhere. So within the inflation basket, there will be big relative price changes because we spend less, maybe on durables, maybe on non-essentials, maybe on restaurant meals, etc. So there are price adjustments within that. But talking about employment, so yes, there's negative impacts, but I think if we look at the broad trends from very weak economic growth before COVID, we are seeing an improving trend in terms of politics, in terms of policy. So economic growth should gradually trend higher. That means employment will also rightly be positive trend going forward, perhaps not significant. And we have to remember that within a better employment growth trend going forward, perhaps we have to realize that the unemployment rate will remain high for long, because as we see better economic growth, better employment prospects, lots of the disillusioned job seekers that haven't been officially counted as unemployed, they come back into the labor market. Once they come back into the labor market looking for a job, anticipating better environment and perhaps getting a job, they are counted as unemployed. So the unemployment rate remains high for long, even though the underlying employment trend improves. So that's important to remember. We're seeing a better economic growth trend going forward. So the employment trend should gradually improve as well. But you're quite right. In the short term, there's lots of potential negatives in terms of consumer spending. But we're all savvy consumers. We adjust our spending patterns. And if we hear that food price inflation is 10% or whatever the number you hear, that's not all of us individual inflation rates, because we adjust our spending patterns. And that's important to remember. We've all got very different individual inflation rates.
Indeed. Johann, thank you very much for your time. That was Johann Els. He's the chief economist at Old Mutual.